like Ebony said, I'm Jen Neitzel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Educational Equity Institute.
Okay, so before we get started, we just want to say that we don't really do diversity and inclusion trainings, so some of the content may be a little bit difficult for individuals. And the reason why we don't do diversity and inclusion training, because we feel like there's a lot of work that's being done around that area, and we are really committed to transformational and lasting change. And in order to do that work, we really have to take a look at the root causes that contribute to the inequities that exist, not just in our society, but also in our institutions. So with that being said, I am going to dive into the conversation. All right. Jen, you normally do these, so I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we, like Ebony said, that we really have pushed in our work to, like when we first started, we were very much focused. We were basically doing multicultural or anti-bias work. And so it really, the turning point for us was after the murder of George Floyd, and in redoing some of our approach and how we work to achieve equity and justice in education. So we do, like Ebony said, we have to talk about some really challenging things, which can be really uncomfortable, but it's important that we push through that discomfort, because it's an opportunity for growth. And so with that being said, you can see some of these participant objectives and what we're going to be talking about today. So we really want you to be able to define key terms. It is essential in equity work that we have a common language and understanding of the terms, or else we're just not going to be able to work together collectively. So we want you to be able to define key terms like equity and racism and white supremacy. We also want you to be able to identify key barriers within early learning settings that perpetuate inequitable outcomes for Black children. And then also we want you to be able to develop greater self-awareness about yourselves, because self-reflection and internal work is a huge part of equity, so that we can, you can alter your practices within your classroom, your organization, your program to promote equity. So, when we do our trainings, we really spend a good amount of time grounding, like 15 to 20 minutes grounding people, because we feel like that grounding is essential, talking about hard things. So we always start out with these assumptions. So we all believe that a student's color should not fate him or her to negative outcomes. That's something that we can all agree on. We also recognize that discussing equity and race is uncomfortable. We have been, socialized within the society to not talk about race and racism. And so we just encourage you to lean into that discomfort. We also recognize that creating discomfort without providing for effective strategies is not productive. And then we also, the final assumption is that we just want you guys to understand that when in discussing equity and taking steps, we're going to make mistakes. We're human beings. We've all been socialized and grown up in a society that is grounded in racism and white supremacy. And, we do separate processing sessions sometimes. When we do trainings, we always have separate processing sessions for white people to process together and then people of color to process together. And I was in a white processing session, and they were very worried about talking about race because they didn't want to make a mistake. And I just said to them, you're going to make mistakes. Like, you just have to understand that you're going to make mistakes in talking about these things, and just give yourself grace and grace to others as we move through this work. And so just establishing our group norms, Ebonyse and I, we work very hard to create brave spaces where people feel comfortable enough to discuss, exchange, learn, and be vulnerable enough to you can speak your truth. And we recognize that everybody is at different entry points with this work. We recognize that everybody is on their own individual journeys. Different people have been exposed in different ways to this content. Some have lived experience, but we want you to encourage you to, in the chat, participate in the chat, speak your truth. Again, lean into the discomfort and lean into each other for support. Relationships are absolutely critical to equity work. And so when we can lean into each other for support, then we can, more collectively work together for lasting change. Again, commit to non-closure. It took us over 400 years to get here. We are not going to solve equity in this training or this workshop or this session. Ebonyse and I often say it's going to take us 11 generations to fix this problem. So, but I'm a big podcast person. So anyway, I always say this podcast I listen to with Brene Brown and Austin Channing Brown, which is I've listened to 3 times. But anyway, what Brene Brown says in this podcast is with every hard conversation, a piece of the system falls away. And so, we really can have hard conversations, because when we do that, we are committed to healing from the wounds of racism and white supremacy, and we can move forward in a more intentional way. Always assume positive intent and continue to seek intentional learning after this. Again, like I said, internal work is a huge part of equity. And so we have to be committed to that. Yes, I can share that as soon as I'm done. So I'm going to turn it over to Ebonyse, and I will put that podcast in the chat.
Jen, are you done?
Yeah, I turned it over to you.
Okay, because I think I froze. So before we dive into the content, we just always ask that you all keep these questions top of mind. So we really want you all to just, reflect on, the racially and ethnically diverse families or children and communities that you may be serving. And so just some questions to keep top of mind is, how can I better serve culturally diverse children, families, and the communities in which they live? What do I need to do to become an equity-minded practitioner? What does my program need to be more inclusive of diverse children and families? And then lastly, just thinking about what barriers exist that may prevent you or your program from being more inclusive and equitable. And so I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before. It does a really good job of illustrating the difference between equality and equity. And we just want to start out by acknowledging some of the racial disparities that exist in education. And so we know children of color, particularly Black children, often experience disproportionate rates of suspension and exposure, that they lack access to high quality instruction, and they are often overrepresented in special education and underrepresented in gifted and talented programs. And so Jen talked earlier about how when we started this work, we really, had an anti-bias framework and looking at multicultural education, which is great. There's room for all of that. And when we think about this idea of the achievement gap, multicultural education really was discovered to kind of address those issues. And so when we think about, the term multicultural education and where it derived from, 20, 30 years ago, it was really looking at identity and being able to confront issues of power and privilege in our society by challenging racism, biases, and inequitable structures, policies, practices, and schools and within our society. But multicultural education has shifted over time. And so the problems with just focusing solely on multicultural education is that some efforts of multicultural education have focused more on celebrating differences and affirming identity. And we don't think that anything's wrong with that, but again, that's not going to move the needle to this transformational and lasting work that needs to happen, and particularly addressing root causes. There has been less attention on challenging racism and inequitable structures, policies, and practices. Ideas of diversity, inclusion, and equality, cultural competence, anti-bias, and culturally relevant teaching practices have flourished. And again, we're not dismissing any of that. but we really do have to pay more attention to the root causes and challenging racism and those structural barriers. And then conversations about the achievement gap, they continue to exist because we have not addressed those root causes within our society that create inequities in our institutions, and particularly education. Some of the equity efforts thus far, we live in a very punitive society, so there's a reliance on punishment versus discipline. And we know that true discipline is actually teaching. There's a focus on implementing isolated interventions instead of doing more collective and community work. Educational practices are based on white European values, and this also is very rooted in early childhood education. We'll talk about that later. There's this new emphasis on trauma-informed care, which is really great, but we really want to be intentional about how we approach this work, especially when we talk about resilience, because we don't want to approach it from a deficit model as if children and families, particularly children and families of color, as if they don't already have, if they're not already resilient. So we really want to be intentional about how we approach this emphasis on trauma-informed care. And there's a lot of silo efforts within our communities. We see that within the early childhood system in North Carolina. And so again, there has to be, intentionality around being more collaborative and collective. And there's a focus on kindness, compassion, and empathy, which those are great qualities to have, but those are not going to move the needle in the direction that we need it to go in order to address root causes and challenge racism and white supremacy in our society. And so in addressing these root causes, we must move beyond examining biases, becoming culturally competent, and implementing culturally relevant teaching practices. Examining biases is a very, integral part of the work, but that's not all of the work. So again, we must be intentional about moving beyond that work. To achieve racial equity and create socially just programs for all children, we must address the root causes by refocusing our attention on challenging racism and inequitable structures, policies, and practices, deconstruct this idea of whiteness as the norm within our educational system. We have to be able to confront issues of power and privilege in our society, and then engage in efforts to heal from racial trauma, and especially when we think about how racism impacts Black children and other children of color and their sense of self and identity. And so we're going to start off with some terms, as Jen mentioned, with the participant objectives, we often define just a few terms just to make sure that we're establishing a shared language. And so racial justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. So some indicators of racial justice is that equitable impacts and outcomes, that they exist across race. What racial justice is not, it is definitely not diversity, because diversity means variety. It is not equality, because equality means sameness. But racial justice is really looking at equity. It's giving individuals what they need based on their needs, the redistribution of resources, and it's about fairness and justice. And so I'm sure many of you have seen this slide as well. And so typically where we are in our society, and this also includes our educational system, is we have this emphasis on equality. In early childhood, we often say we want to make sure that all children have access to high quality early learning experiences. And while that's great, we know that all children are not coming to us needing the same things. And so we really have to have a focus on equity. And once we have a focus on equity, and we have been really intentional about looking at our policies, looking at our practices, and really creating equitable learning environments, that leads us to more work around justice. And because we have identified those barriers and eliminated those policies, as you can see in this last illustration with them tearing down the fence, that leads us to justice, because we no longer have to redistribute the resources that we have created an environment that is socially just. So we know that education is supposed to be the great equalizer. The Brown versus Board, 1954, was supposed to, equalize education for Black children and other children of color. But here we are still having conversations about the achievement gap. And Jen and I like to use the term the opportunity gap to really acknowledge how those inequities were in place before children even entered the school system. And so we just want to take a few moments to just focus on instructional practices, disciplinary practices, and teacher-child relationships. So some of you have probably seen this data before. This data comes from the United States Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. They were collecting data around 2012, 13, 14, but I don't think that they're collecting data anymore because of the previous presidential administration. So hopefully with this new administration, these data will be collected again. And so what they found was that there were 5,000 preschoolers were suspended at least once, and nearly 2,500 were suspended a second time. And I believe this is public preschools. And that Black preschoolers are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers, whereas boys are 49% of the preschool population, but make up 82% of all preschool suspensions. And whereas girls make up 20% of the female preschool population, they represent 54% of females preschoolers suspended more than once. So there's some work that we have to do as educators and other professionals working with young children, because we are ushering young children out of the very environments that are designed to support not only their academic achievement, but their social-emotional development as well. And so we like to use this term cradle to prison pipeline instead of the preschool to prison pipeline for the very same reasons we like to use the opportunity gap, to just really highlight how those inequities existed, prenatally. When we think about, lack of prenatal care and infant mortality and all of those types of things. And so we use the term cradle to prison pipeline to really provide a holistic view of the inequities that exist before children even enter the school system. And so the term preschool to prison pipeline was coined to describe the disproportionate number of young Black children who are suspended or expelled from early learning environments. And what we know about exclusionary practices from the research is that it results in interrupted education. So there's this loss of vital instruction time for young children. It increases the likelihood that Black children experience repeated suspensions and expulsions both in early childhood and beyond. It's related to later academic achievement and the school dropout rates. And then it creates this interest into the criminal justice system. So when we think about disciplinary practices, we also have to think about, well, what are some of the inequities that exist in instructional practices? And so what the research tells us is that students of color tend to experience lower quality instructional practices than their white peers, and that Black children generally experience lower quality activity settings and receive fewer rich, stimulating experiences than white children. So again, like I said earlier, we look at disciplinary practices, we look at instructional practices, but we know that teacher-child relationships are essential, especially for students performing well. We know that high expectation, is a must that teachers must have for students. And so Black children tend to have relationships with their teachers that are less positive than those formed with white children. And the research also tells us that Black children have more negative and conflictual relationships with teachers than white children. And so when we think about the current work around equity, it's grounded in this idea of color blindness. And Jen, she talks about her experience when she was getting her training to be a teacher, and how teachers are often, trained in this idea of color blindness, not to see color. And I've done trainings before where I've heard teachers say things like, well, children are just children. And, I really don't see color. And I don't care if children, if children are white, Black, polka dot, green. Well, we know children aren't, polka dot, green. We also know children aren't white and Black either. So we really have to address this idea of colorblindness because it really is dangerous. You know, it's the belief that there is no racial hierarchy in our society, and we know that that is not true. It's a failure to consider the permanence of race roles within our nation's institutions. It creates this reliance on band-aid interventions or approaches. And so when when there's a problem or issue that needs to be addressed, we address the symptom instead of addressing the root causes. And it sustains white as the norm and ensures this cultural frame of reference for all behaviors, interactions, and experiences, as well as the establishment of policies and practices. And so as we talk about color blindness, we just want to provide the definition of colorblind racism that was coined by sociology professor at Duke University, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silver. And what he says is that colorblind racism is a racial ideology that rationalizes racial inequality using non-racial language. So I just want you to think about what that definition like really means, like let that sit with you. And he continues to argue that colorblind racism legitimizes the specific practices that maintain racial inequalities and white supremacy. And so some examples that he gives of colorblind racism is this idea of meritocracy, which we know is a American value. This idea that you lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and that if you work really hard in this country, that you can, achieve anything just by your merit alone. And we know that that's not true, because we know that there are systems that were set up for individuals in this country that other groups do not benefit the same way from. Another example is gaps in education, housing discrimination, and voter disenfranchisement, which is, happening in the state where I am right now in Georgia. So these are just some examples of colorblind racism. And so we want to turn our attention a little bit to structural racism and institutional racism, again, because this is where the conversation needs to happen when we are talking about transformational and lasting change. And so structural racism is racial bias among institutions and across society. It involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. It is built into our history, into our culture, our ideology, and interactions within institutions and policies. And so if we just unpack structural racism and take a deeper look at it, if we think about our history, it provides the foundation of white supremacy, slavery, colonization, and Jim Crow. Again, it's embedded in our culture. It exists around us all in our daily life. It provides the normalization and the preparation and the, I don't know why I want to say preparation, but the maintenance of racism in this country. It places this value on whiteness as the norm in our society, and that this idea of whiteness is like everyone's experience. And then it's deeply embedded in our social structures. And so we think about our political structures, our economic structures, our education, all of those things. And so it's the interconnected institutions and policies, it's those key relationships and rules across society, providing the legitimacy and reinforcement to maintain and perpetuate racism. And so next, we have to think about institutional racism. And one thing to know about structural racism is that all other forms of racism emerge from structural racism because it is built within the structure, within the DNA of society. And so institutional racism emerges from structural racism. And so institutional racism it occurs within institutions and systems of power. It is the unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions, so our schools, our workplace, the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, those different systems in which we operate within that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for whites. So if you take a look at the image, and every system in which, again, we operate within, the food system, the housing system, healthcare, criminal justice, institutional racism is deeply embedded within those institutions. And so we also find it very helpful because we find that so many people get the terms prejudice and racism mixed up, or not sure who can be, prejudiced and who can be a racist. So we just like to have this little chat exercise. If you can type in the chat, in what ways are whites racist towards people of color? Okay, pulling their purse closer to them when near a person of color, keeping them out of different spaces and communities, racism in hiring practices, denying voting rights, denying jobs, crossing the street, white doctors not giving equitable health care, ignoring people of color, assuming they are poor, not wanting to be around them, their perceptions and assumptions, making assumptions about intent anytime power is used to oppress. Okay, thank you all. So now we have a similar question, but we just flipped it. So we want you to tell us, in what ways are people of color racist towards whites? And I don't know if these answers are for the first question. Okay, Mariah says people of color can't be racist. No ways, they are not. Okay, thank you all. Let's see. Libby says, assuming racism is to blame. Oh my gosh, it's going so fast. I don't know. Stereotype based on experiences, assuming everyone is looking at them because they're different perceptions. I can't think of any off the top. Cannot be racist. Assume that white people are against people of color, that all white people are against people of color. Okay. Feel whites get everything. Okay. All right. Thank you all. So we're going to move on. So this is the image that we like to show to really illustrate what I like to call what the equation is for racism or any type of ism. And so we all have prejudice and we all have biases, but the difference is when we combine that with the power, the institutional, the historical, the political, the economic, the social power. So when we combine prejudice plus that collective power, that institutional power, then we get the ism. And so this particular session is on racism, but if we were talking about, classism, or if we were talking about sexism, the equation will still be the same. So it's the prejudice that one holds plus the power. And because people of color do not collectively hold that institutional, that political, that economic, that social power within this country, people of color can be prejudiced, but they cannot be racist. We get a lot of conversation around that. But we just really want to make that clear because we know the importance of establishing these terms and developing a shared language so we can know what we are actually working towards when we're talking about equity. So I want to turn our attention now to just talk a little bit about power. And so we have to understand that when we're talking about power in terms of racism, that it must be understood as a relational term between human beings in a historical, economic, political, and social setting. So power is control of or access to those institutions that are sanctioned by the state. It is ownership and control of the major resources of a state and the capacity to make and enforce decisions based on this ownership and control. It is also the capacity of a group of people to decide what they want and to act in an organized way to get it. And lastly, this one I think is really, really important to understand about power. It is the ability to define reality and to convince other people that that is their definition. And so when Jen talked about, how we were all socialized in a racist and white supremacy society, when we think about power in terms of that, in terms of being socialized in this way. So when these forms of power are exercised against people based solely on race, it results in a system of racial oppression. And so in the United States, the most significant manifestations of racial oppression are individual racism, structural racism, institutional racism, cultural and linguistic racism, environmental racism, economic racism, and then the racism that is experienced within the healthcare system. And so, like I said, we want to define, prejudice and racism. And so prejudice is defined as the learned prejudgment towards social others and refers to the internal thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and assumptions based on the group to which they belong. And so again, we all hold prejudice and, have been, probably demonstrated some, prejudice against, other people, but it's really important to understand who has the power to actually be racist. And so prejudice leads to discrimination. Discrimination occurs when we act out on our prejudice. And so our prejudice towards others influence our thoughts and our actions. And some, examples of discrimination could include ignoring people, purposefully avoiding or excluding or ridiculing people, jokes or even threats. And when we think about discrimination, then discrimination can lead to oppression. And so oppression, so that going back to that image that I showed when I talked about the equation. So oppression is the prejudice and discrimination of one social group against another that is backed by that institutional power. And so again, that power is, the social, the economic, the political power. Discrimination occurs at the individual level, so like at the micro level, where oppression occurs at the macro level. And so some examples of oppression include sexism, racism, classism, ableism, heterosexism. These are just a few examples. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about internalized racial superiority.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and I promise like all of this ties back into the early childhood system, and we're going to get there. But we have to understand, like Ebony said at the beginning, we have to understand the root causes. We have to understand the issues deeply if we're going to transform our early childhood system into a more just place for children and families. When we're talking about internalized racial superiority, this is what we're talking about, the messages that we have received as white people within our society, implicitly and explicitly, right? And so we internalize and act out, often unintentionally, the constant messages that are circulating in the culture that, and I'm saying we as a white person, that our group is superior to the minoritized group. And so some consequences of internalized racial superiority include white saviorism, thinking we can fix people of color, a resistance to change, defensiveness, white fragility, misinformed about the history and the roles that white people have played in racism. I think this is the biggest thing that we notice in our session, in our trainings that we do, is that everybody, when we go through the history, people are like, why weren't we taught this in school? And that was intentional because, people don't want us to see the truth of our country. And we see that backlash right now in terms of, schools, bringing the 1619 Project in, or critical race theory and stuff. There's a pushback against teaching the true history of our country because of all of these internalized racial superiority. There's a sense of entitlement, blaming, labeling, assumption of normalcy, and just continued oppression. And so, it's important for us to really dig into this white fragility, because I think that white fragility really is the primary barrier for white people getting more deeply engaged in equity work. And, when we're talking about white fragility, white people have had little to no experience discussing race or racism in cross-cultural settings. And white people typically respond very emotionally with anger, defensiveness, and guilt. And a common response is crying. And so what crying does, it stops the racial dialogue and refocuses the attention and the energy on taking care of the white person in distress, which is a huge issue. And so, Ebony was talking about resilience earlier, and, I really think that, white people are the ones that don't have resilience within our society, because when we're pushed to talk about hard things like race and racism, there's this anger, defensiveness, and guilt. And so we, as white people, really need to push through and examine, why do I feel angry? Why do I feel defensive? Why do I feel guilty when we are confronted with some of these hard truths? So you can go to the next one, Ebonyse. And so now we're going to watch this really excellent video on white fragility, and we're going to do a little chit chat afterwards.
White fragility is the defensiveness, the argumentation, the hurt feelings, the withdrawal that often erupts whenever white people are challenged on their racial worldviews.
You know what? This is a color-free zone here. Stanley, I don't look at you as another race.
See, this is what I'm talking about. We don't have to pretend that we're colorblind.
Exactly.
That's fighting ignorance with more ignorance.
The fragility part is meant to capture how little it takes to cause white people to erupt in defensiveness. But the impact of that defensiveness, however, is not fragile at all. It functions as a kind of everyday white racial control by making it so difficult for people to challenge us on our unaware assumptions and biases that most of the time they don't. And so it functions to keep everybody in their place and protect the racial hierarchy.
No, I'm not a racist. I am the least racist person you have ever interviewed. That I can tell you.
Some defensiveness is natural. It's a natural part of the process. The key is that you must move through that defensiveness. It's defensiveness that functions to refuse to engage, to protect a very limited worldview, to let in no information or no challenge.
Guys, come on, okay? I just want to be able to do and say whatever I want, whenever I want, and I don't want to have to think about the world's problems.
It serves us not to speak about it. Racism is the status quo. It is the status quo of your society, of my society, of all Western-oriented white settler colonialist cultures. And that status quo of racism is comfortable for me as a white person virtually 24/7.
This country's judicial system has not been great for us.
No. And here comes a 2-hour lecture on black stuff. God, I wish my proxy were here. Go ahead.
So I am not going to get to where I need to go from a place of white comfort. I'm going to have to get mighty uncomfortable in order to challenge that.
When somebody tells me that they don't see race, I say, that's fine. You can choose not to see the sky, but it exists.
The number one question I'm asked is, what do we do? And before I answer that, I want to offer a couple of challenges to that question, because I find it a very problematic question. So the first thing is to think long and deep about what it took for you to ask that question. How in 2020, your question could be, what do I do about racism? How you have managed not to know, and write down how you have managed to be a full functioning adult in 2020 and not know what to do about racism. And everything you write down will be your map, and nothing you write down will be easy to address, but everything on it can be addressed. And then get to work. It's like saying, I want to be in shape tomorrow. You won't be in shape tomorrow. And to get in shape will be a multi-part process. After you've made that list, one of the next things I would ask you to do is to take Dr. Eddie Moore's 21-day challenge and read Layla Said's book, Me and White Supremacy Workbook. Both of those are active processes that will put you on the path.
What you can do is extend that privilege so that you can dismantle it, right? So you can create opportunity for people, you can amplify issues in ways that other people can't, and you can use your resources to create space for people.
Let's switch seats. No, let's switch seats.
Any thoughts about that video? Any feelings, anything that came up for you as you were watching that? Lean into the discomfort, right? Vulnerability. I'm not calling you out to say any truth. Okay, thank you. It always just takes one person. I loved it. It has a great point. Hard to hear, but I needed to hear it. I just look forward to the day when we can all sit down and discuss our biases. We're getting, not all of us, but a lot of us are starting to be able to do those things. So, okay, great. I think it was a great illustration. All right, awesome. Okay, thank you. Very thought-provoking. Yeah, changing seats doesn't change the situation. Exactly. I always thought I wasn't fragile about white racism, but this session others are helping me feel the discomfort you're talking about, and that's a good thing. Okay, great, Linda. I'm glad you said that. All right, let's move on.
Okay.
White fragility.
All right, this is you, Ebonyse.
Oh, wait. So as Jen talked about internalized racial superiority, and I'm going to talk about internalized racial oppression. So again, the messages that circulate in our society about Black people and other people of color, you know, we internalize those messages. And so it's the internalizing and acting out, often unintentionally, the constant messages that me and our group or other groups of color are inferior to the dominant group. And so some manifestations of internalized racial oppression is like this idea of a sense of inferiority, you know, maybe having low self-esteem, self-doubt, even self-hate, shame and rage, the idea that we have to assimilate, denial, you know, anger, conflict between racial groups. Jen talked about the processing sessions that we do when we do a processing session for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And in this particular session, there was a woman that was from Africa, and there was a woman that was from the Caribbeans. And I want to say she was from Trinidad, but I can't remember. But anyway, they were sharing their experiences about coming to America, and they did not want to be perceived as Black Americans because they knew very well the stereotypes and the perceptions of being Black in America and what that actually meant. And so they really want, even though, you know, they fully acknowledge, as you know, particularly the woman from Trinidad, that, you know, they have, and you know, their ancestry is, you know, it's from Africa. But they really wanted to distinguish themselves from not being perceived as Black Americans because of the stereotype and the perception of being Black in America and what that holds. This idea of mediocrity, violence, threats of violence, division, isolation, and then colorism. And so we talked about white fragility as being a consequence of internalized racial oppression. So we're going to talk about colorism as a manifestation of internalized racial oppression. And so colorism is the process of discrimination that privileges light-skinned people of color over their dark-skinned counterparts. It has its origins in Eurocentrism and racism. And just as race privileged whites, colorism privileged light-skinned individuals. So just let me make sure you all can hear the sound. So we're going to watch this quick video. I don't know why it takes a minute for the video to play. Okay, there it is.
My daughter was not lit properly in the class photo, and someone decided to print it anyway.
Yeah, it's gonna be a fight. All right, let me give you a little context. Black people come in many shades, from Mariah Carey to Wesley Snipes. Because we look different, we get discriminated against differently. Like in the case of OJ, a magazine made his skin look darker to make him seem more villainous. And sadly, it's not just done to us, like with the "Are you darker than a brown paper bag" test. Sometimes we even discriminate against each other. It's called colorism. The racist belief that light skin is good and dark skin is bad. But it's not just us. People are color struck all around the world. In Asian communities, some people use umbrellas and visors to avoid the sun. In Indian communities, some dark-skinned actors say they have trouble starring even in Bollywood movies. And in the Latin community, products that bleach your skin are becoming increasingly popular. But with Black Americans, people believe colorism was the brainchild of a slave owner named Willie Lynch, who taught other slave owners how to control us by dividing us by color. Turns out, the story of Willie Lynch is a hoax. But it felt real because of the fact that slave owners did divide us by color, putting dark slaves in the field and light slaves in the house. This separation caused deep-seated tension and resentment that continues to this day. The resentment is so great that it makes us hypersensitive to issues of complexion, which brings us back to this. It's going to be a fight!
All right, so just to continue on colorism, it's a byproduct of racism. It has its roots in slavery and in colonization. It's a manifestation of internalized racial oppression and creates intra-group conflict. And it's often perpetuated unintentionally or intentionally sometimes within the media, television, film, also within our families and within our communities. And so I'm sure that, if we talk to, Black individuals and other people of color, there are countless of stories of how colorism has shown up. And we could even, point to some television programs. The one example that I like to use is Martin, if any of you are familiar with that television show, and the relationship that between Gina and Pam. And Gina is this, she's the one that has the college degree, and she's very smart and she's jovial, and she's, kind of very light, where Pam is kind of rough and hard, and Pam can never get a man, and Pam is always the butt of Martin's, jokes, and Pam is Gina's assistant. And so we don't necessarily think about that, but when we are looking at colorism, it's often, right in our face. And like I said, potentially, particularly perpetuated in media, television, and film. And so I'm going to turn it over back to Jen.
Okay, and so now we're going to dive into what I call get your hot tea and your cozy socks content. So it's important that when we're talking about race and racism, we have to dive into the social construction of race. And so, we also go back to, we've all heard about 1619 at this point. And so when the first, enslaved Africans arrived on our shores, but the term white and Black was not actually created until the 17th century. And it was created by Virginia slave owners. The first law, talking about whiteness was in Virginia. And it replaced the terms Christian and Englishman, which were generally used to distinguish European colonists from Africans and other indigenous peoples. And so what happened is it was established after Bacon's Rebellion. And so with Bacon's Rebellion, Black and white indentured servants actually lived together, they worked together, and then they rebelled together against the conditions and against indentured servitude. And so what happened after Bacon's Rebellion is that's when the terms white and Black were constructed, because it was this divide and conquer strategy. And the best way they could do it is by dehumanizing enslaved Africans based on their skin color and making them seem, less than human. And so what happened is that the white landowning men, they gave scraps to the indentured servants. Like, you can have a little bit of land, you can have, be overseers on the plantation. And so that's how, I was listening to this podcast with Resma Menachem. And so he was saying, oh, okay, so, I can have a little bit of land, I can have a little bit of power, and I don't have to be that, I'm all in. And so that's how these indentured servants were able to morph into whiteness that was constructed in in Virginia, but it quickly spread to other southern states. And so in this creation of white, like I said, meant giving privileges to some while denying them to others with the justification of biological and social inferiority. And so when we're talking about the racial caste system that still exists within our society, you know, these white landowning men, they actually created our nation's institutions that were based on whiteness. And we can still see the remnants of that today. And I think it provides a little bit greater context about what we're witnessing in our society right now as well. And so, like I said, these white and black indentured servants, they lived and worked and rebelled together. And after slavery, these poor white and black people lived in very similar conditions, and this created anger because their whiteness did not help them achieve upward mobility. And so, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois, he actually talks about this concept called wage of whiteness, where, you know, poor working class white people were given, you know, a menial wage, but what kept them from, you know, rebelling against that even further is because they could be absorbed into whiteness, because they didn't have to be that. And so this, to create this separation from, you know, the poor white and black people, and to avoid the shame of being subhuman, this is what has led to that overt racism that we see even carrying out today.
Can I add something really quickly?
Sure.
I think I think it's really important to acknowledge here where we see a lot of the overt racism is after, like, slaves were free and you had freedmen establishing businesses, and you know, this beginning to accumulate some wealth. And so, like Jen said, you know, in order to avoid the shame and this idea, like, how, you know, how dare you, because at once you were this, you know, considered this subhuman, and you were enslaved, and I had, you know, like a one up on you, like, you know, how dare you progress in this country while I'm not. And so, to, again, like Jen said, avoid the shame. And then this is where we see overt racism and this emergence of just violence in this country. Okay.
Right. And just piggyback on that too, Ebonyse, is like, you know, that's why we had the Black massacres, like Black Wall Street, and what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, is because there was a very robust Black economic situation in those cities, and it was not okay for poor and working class whites, because then that made them better than them.
Sure, absolutely.
All right, so then we need to talk about this white European ideology and education. And so, you know, this is why we have to give all of this context for institutional racism and structural racism and all of these things, because when we look at this tree, we can see, like, the roots of our education system are grounded within institutional racism. And what happens, and this is early childhood too, I know early childhood educators like to say, well, you know, like we take great pride in loving our babies, but it's like, we have to understand that no system in this country is immune to racism. And so the roots of our educational system are in institutional racism. And this leads to the cultural norms and the values and beliefs and implicit biases that then grow into the disciplinary practices, the teacher-child relationships, and the instructional practices that Ebonyse talked about. And so, you know, so when we're talking about disrupting the roots, we're talking about disrupting that structural racism, that institutional racism, and white supremacy itself. And so what is whiteness? So we talk a lot about whiteness. And so when we're talking the whiteness as a construct, and we have to deconstruct whiteness if we're going to make changes within our educational system. So whiteness is viewed as the norm. It's the standard for universal human values by which all others are viewed and to which they're compared. And so Bell Hooks, she talks about authority of experience versus oppression of experience. And when we're talking about, you know, whiteness viewed as the norm for all, you know, universal human values and experiences, that white experience is the authority of experience. And so when there's an authority of experience, then there's an oppression of other experiences. And so Black people and other people of color, but it's grounded, that oppression of experience is actually that's grounded in anti-Blackness. And so when we're talking about whiteness, we're actually talking about affluent whiteness, right? And so when we go back and we look at the history of our country and who formed our nation's institutions, it was white, wealthy, and men. And so that has become the standard for experience in this country, that everybody, has been, receives messages. That's what we strive for, is that affluent whiteness within society. And so when we're looking at white supremacy, it's really important, in our trainings, we spend a lot more time on white supremacy and whiteness and all of these things, because it's incredibly important that we have to deconstruct all of these things, because these terms can make people really uncomfortable. And so, oftentimes, like, people, think of white supremacy as the KKK or, Proud Boys and those kinds of organizations, those alt-right organizations. But white supremacy is actually an ideology, it's a system, and it's a culture. And so the ideology that has created the systems and perpetuated the culture assumes that there's this inherent belief that white people are superior to all other racialized groups and therefore should dominate society. And it's this racist ideology that assigns value and morality and goodness and humanity to the white group, while casting people in communities of color as worthless, criminal, inhuman, and undeserving. And so that ideology that was, has the roots deep within our nation's history, was then used to set up our nation's systems. And so these systems are then, it's a political, economic, and social order based on the historical and current accumulation of structural power that privileges white people as a group. And so when we're looking at our systems right now, and I think this discussion provides greater context and understanding about what we're witnessing within our society, because what we are witnessing is a group of people desperately trying to uphold our white supremacist systems through, voter disenfranchisement, voter regulation laws, anything that they can do to make sure that they stay in power and privilege. And white supremacy, it doesn't refer to individual white people and their individual intentions, and I think that's really important. It is an ideology, a system, and then a culture that perpetuates a system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of white wealth, power, and privilege. And so we can see, white supremacy in any colonized nation in our across the world. And so it's really important to have a discussion about white supremacy. And so when we're thinking about white supremacy, like I said, when we think about white supremacy, we're also often thinking about that overt white supremacy that is socially unacceptable. So, hate crimes, the KKK, the N-word, racial slurs, racist jokes, but we also have to look at this covert white supremacy, which is socially acceptable. And so I really want you guys to look at this graphic and think about, the things that jump out at you that, maybe have been socially acceptable in your sphere or whatever. And so when I look at this, it's like, paternalism is a big one. But what about me? The self-appointed white ally. All of these things are socially acceptable forms of white supremacy that are, it's kind of like that iceberg diagram or graphic that you see sometimes, where it's like, when we think about it, that overt white supremacy is the tip, but there's more underneath that we don't even think about, because it's just become part of our culture or within society. I know it's hard, isn't it, Ebonyse? I usually have control of the slides, and she gives me a hard time because I zoom forward, and so now she's in the driver's seat today. And so these are the false narratives of white supremacy in education, right? Because we have been fed false narratives in our society. And so we have to replace those false narratives with new narratives. And so whiteness, it dictates how and what children are taught. It tells us what achievement looks like, our early learning standards, grades, test scores. When I think about like my junior in high school, the high school he goes to, well, I mean, just in general, it's like, you know, in North Carolina, I don't know if it's like this in other states, but it's like pushing forward with those EOGs, even though kids haven't been in school for the majority of the year. We're going to make these children go through this, even though they haven't been in person school. So whiteness determines what high quality education looks like. You know, a teacher is purveyor of knowledge, a child is a recipient of knowledge. Whiteness doesn't allow for the acknowledgement of multiple intelligences. And when I'm talking about multiple intelligences, I'm talking about children having opportunities to show what they're capable of in different ways, as opposed to a single right answer, or, you know, answering a test question correctly. And so, you know, it doesn't allow for those kinds of things. And whiteness dictates what behaviors are acceptable and not acceptable in school. And so when we look back at those disciplinary practices and the disparities of disciplinary practices, and we deconstruct whiteness in terms of who makes decisions about what behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable in school, we really have to deconstruct that. Is she gonna do it? Is she gonna do it?
Gonna go really slow.
That's it. That's it. All right. So when we go back to the history of our country and how the education system was set up, it was set up to enable and perpetuate white supremacy. So it told us who could learn. It told us who got funding and resources and how much. When we think about the segregated schools before Brown versus Board of Education, and even now, who's getting the funding in their schools, but you know, that white and Black schools were given the same, they were given money per pupil. And so because the Black schools were underpopulated, all of those funds then went back, that were not used, went back into the white schools. And so white schools were overfunded and Black schools were underfunded. See, you did it. You did
Jesus
it.
Christ. Jesus Christ.
Then it forced Black children to learn in an education system that is not set up for them. And so when we think about, you know, we're forcing Black children and continuing to do so, we're forcing Black children into a system that was not set up for them. Again, the myth of meritocracy, the use of curricula and teaching methods and assessments and environmental skills that have been designed by white people, and not saying that those curricula and those teaching methods and environmental skills don't offer really great things for early childhood, but they need to include additional voices and experiences so we can reimagine what quality education looks like. And we're thinking about, you know, the controlling of bodies and emotions and knowledge and access. This is what our educational system was set up to do.
Jen, can you go back and talk about, like, you talked about the funding, right? But I think it's important for you to talk about why Black children were not in school.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and I've skipped over where children could learn, where children learn too. So the reason that Black schools were underpopulated is because the children had, one is that they were, the school year for Black schools was highly restricted. So a lot of times Black children were only in school for 4 months out of the year. Or their school days were, you know, 4 hours a day. And so, and a lot of children couldn't attend school because they had to help with their families with the sharecropping so that they could actually, you know, make ends meet or get paid a little bit. And so we have to think about like all of this, how everything is intertwined and is set up this cumulative, these cumulative structures have been put in place over time to disadvantage Black people and to advantage white people. And just where children could learn. So another reason a lot of Black children during segregation couldn't get to school is because the school, they didn't provide public transportation. And so children had to walk a really long way to get to school. And so they made it very hard for Black children to engage in education within our society. And so this has had cumulative effects across generation to generation that we're working to undo now. Is that what you wanted me to say?
That is exactly what I wanted you to say. But I also wanted to just acknowledge, like, when we talk about Black children learning, that the educational system wasn't set up for them, sometimes people say, well, what about things like Head Start, right? Well, Head Start was formed to address this quote unquote war on poverty, but it was from this deficit model, and that deficit model still exists today when we, with the Black children and Black families about what they are capable of and what they are not capable of. So it was, we need to create, this program to help these poor children. So I think that's just important to acknowledge as well.
Right. And so when we're talking about addressing equity in education, we're really entrenched in what I call this first generation equity work, where we're really focused on implementing isolated or Band-Aid interventions. And so we see this playing out. And so what happens is that, when children of color, particularly Black children, are still falling behind white children, we put another literacy intervention or another math intervention or a social and emotional intervention or a new curricula. And when that doesn't work, then we move on to something else. And so you can see this in my son in the school system where my kids are. My fourth grader has probably had 3 different literacy curricula in his time in elementary school. And we have deep inequities within our school system here. And so that's what I'm talking about with this Band-Aid intervention, which is based upon this blame the victim mentality of Black children and families are at risk and in need of fixing. And what this does is it's this unwillingness to identify and address root causes because, we're doing something, we're putting these interventions in, but it's not addressing the root causes. And so this first generation equity work, it makes us feel like we're doing something meaningful. Like I said, we're putting these interventions in place, but it allows us to stay in a place of comfort because we're not talking about root causes, and it maintains the opportunity and achievement gaps. And so what we need to do is we need to move into second generation equity work. And this term is borrowed from Michael Grailnick, who wrote this chapter in the Handbook of Early Intervention in 1993 on second generation early intervention. And so during this time that he wrote this chapter, early intervention was in the midst of a rapid period of change. And I really feel like that's where we are right now with equity. And Ebonyse and I talk about all the bandwagon equity work that's going on right now is like, all these organizations are popping up to address equity, but they're doing it by diversity, equity, inclusion. And again, not saying that they do serve a purpose, but they're not going to move the needle. And so equity work is really, it's in this rapid period of change. And what Michael Grailnick wanted people to do is he wanted people to move away from superficial analyses regarding the effectiveness of services and supports for young children with disabilities. And he wanted researchers and policymakers to ask more specific questions and develop a more nuanced understanding about how to meet the needs of young children and their families. And that's why it's really important in our schools, in our programs, in our organizations, in our districts. We have to disaggregate the data to see where the disparities are, and that's going to provide us with a roadmap forward to implementing and developing new policies and practices. And so when we're envisioning a transformed educational system, there's one more. I think, yes. Okay. So what we really need to do is focus on the intellectual and spiritual growth of our children. And when we talk about the spiritual growth, I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about helping children connect to who they are and letting them know that they matter simply because they exist. And we need to create schools as places for healing, for children, for families, for teachers, and for staff. And what we all need to do is we need to provide meaningful connections between content and real life experiences. And so when we look at experiences that we provide for children in our current educational system, it's very disconnected from different cultures. It's very focused on whiteness, the white experience. And that's both implicit and explicit. And so we have to alter what we teach and how we teach it. And what we need to do is we need to devise our ideals for academic achievement and like life success. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. called a true revolution of values. And so what this means for the educational system, we need to revise our academic and learning standards and how we measure achievement. That means incorporating additional voices who have not been at the table traditionally to give input about what learning standards and achievement should look like. We need new curricula that are focused on providing culturally responsive anti-bias practices. We need to replace false narratives about our history and our society. We need to learn the truth. We need new definitions of high quality and ways for measuring it. So we have a basis for what high quality looks like, but additional voices need to be included in that. And we have to provide a holistic education that is focused on the mind, body, spirit for children, families, teachers, and staff. And we have to build community, not only within our schools, but within our classrooms, because we live in a very individualistic society, and this is whiteness. This is that affluent whiteness that we have to, go to a certain school, graduate with a certain GPA, go to a specific college, live in a specific neighborhood, drive a specific car. And so we're very individualistic and we're not community oriented, and we have to move more into collectivism. And so we can do that in our schools and classrooms by, having children work together towards a common goal, helping them define what they want to do and work together. Oh, and empower inclusion, empower a diverse set of voices to guide the transformation. This is absolutely critical. So what is needed right now is we need a deep understanding of the issues and the approach needed to achieve lasting change. Improving quality is not going to be enough. Like going back to that tree graphic, like we have to disrupt the roots. Changes in policies about who we hire, discipline, how we discipline, how we identify kids for special education and gifted education, how we prepare our teachers and our early learning standards and our funding. And we need investment in intensive pre and in-service professional development, specifically focused on behavior management and trauma and culturally responsive anti-bias practices. And we need to make a commitment to help children and families and communities heal historical, racial, and multi-generational trauma. And so what we need is anti-racist educators. And so we're going to get real uncomfortable here in a second. So the definition is coming, right, Ebonyse? Yeah, okay. Let's do this.
Not the original. I took that out.
Okay. So let's do this definition first, okay? And I'm going to let you all sit with this for a second, all right? Because this is the single hardest slide that we ever give into our trainings that we do. And so when we look at the definition of racist, this is when we're knowingly or unknowingly supporting ideologies, policies, rhetoric, and practices that uphold the system of white supremacy. This is the default reality for white people. We're implementing Band-Aid interventions and excluding people of color. These are just examples. These are actions. So I'm going to sit with that definition for a second, but then we're going to move into non-racist. And so this is non-reality in the force of racism. And this is the default for most white people. And so, it's like, oh, I'm not a racist. So, but if you're not doing anything to challenge in the anti-racist category, challenge some aspect of white supremacy, you're still moving into the racist category. So it's like, so when we think of non-racist as the default, right? That's a 0. Well, I'm not a racist, but you're not doing anything to challenge. If you add a negative to that, you're still a -1. But if you say, I'm not a racist, but then you're challenging some aspect of white supremacy, that's a +1. So I'm going to sit with this for a moment because I see some raised eyebrows and go ahead and let me have it. Anybody, does this definition make anybody uncomfortable? It makes sense. Anybody else agree? Okay. And if it does make you uncomfortable, I just urge you to sit with it a little bit and just think about, you know, all of the information that we provided today, because it's incredibly important that, and the reason that we include these definitions, actually the definition that we include our trainings is actually a little bit harder than this one, which is probably why Ebonyse
I took it out because we wasn't going to have time to go through that. So
to really dig in. Yeah. So anyway, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to push white people out of complacency into action. And so we all need to be activists right now. And so, and we can't be activists if we're just saying, well, I'm not a racist, so I don't say the N-word. So it's really essential that we are committed, as white people, to anti-racism. All right, so there's stuff going on in the chat.
Yeah, it's a lot
after the march.
I'm sorry, it's a lot of agreeing with what you said.
I don't know, Jessica, can I send the other definition to you and you can send it? I don't know if that's possible.
Yes, if you'd like to send it to me, I can post it to the summary description of your workshop for access.
Okay, I'll send the other definition to Jessica and then do that.
Okay.
And when I say activism too, what?
I was just going to say, I'm going to go back to the other slide.
Right. And I just want to say about activism, like, we have to reimagine what we mean by activism too. Like, not everybody's like, activism just isn't marching in the street. Activism is challenging other white people. Activism is talking to your children about white racism and white supremacy. Activism is, challenging your white people to read books on racism and white supremacy and those kinds of things. So there's far too much complacency, and we all need to be activists in some way. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be marching in the streets. So, all right, back. Okay, so the journey of becoming an anti-racist. So, initially there's this resistance or denial. So I believe racism is over, it's a thing in the past. I talk to others who look and think like me, but then we move into awareness and learning. I acknowledge that racism as an individual and a systemic problem. I examine my biases. I listen to the stories of historically marginalized groups. I think one of the best books, like the newer books that I'm trying to read, like, I'm so fried at the end of the day that I don't want to read. So, I'll show my age that I have to listen to books on tape. But anyway, so it's called 400 Souls. It's an edited book by Ibram X. Kendi. And so each chapter is written by a different person. And it's just, it's like, you think and then you keep reading and you're like, I don't really know. And so that one it basically takes us from 1619 to the present. And so that's a really excellent book that can generate more awareness. And just sitting in your own discomfort, advocating for leadership positions for people of color, actively engaging in challenging policies and practices that produce inequitable outcomes. And there's stuff going on in the chat. Yes, he is going to be what time? At 1:30. Okay. And yes, the other thing I can do, Ebonyse, that wasn't one of the resources that you sent, right? Was the resource list?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, so Jessica, I'm also going to send you the resource list to post as well, if that's okay. And on that resource list, there's like podcast episodes and books and TED Talks and movies.
Did you put Amanda on there?
I didn't. I need to do that too.
Yeah, you should put that on there.
Because I listened to this podcast episode this week with Michael Eric Dyson. Oh my gosh, that was just like a sermon.
He's amazing.
Yeah, so I put that one on there, but I can also add Amend. Amend is Netflix, which is a 4-part series. I think it's 4-part series by Will Smith, which is excellent. All right. So when we're thinking about this, responsibility for perpetuating and legitimizing a racist system rests both on those who actively maintain it and those who refuse to challenge it. So silence is consent. That's why we really push people with the racist, non-racist, and anti-racist definition. And so this is our contact information. If you want to, get in touch with us, you can visit our website to see what we do. We do this on a daily basis.
Talk about the podcast.
Oh, and we have a podcast that we post on there. So there's all sorts of stuff. So we have 5 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions?
You can feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat, whichever.
I just wanted to say, I went to the site where you can download the presentation, but it's not there. So if somebody can make sure that's posted.
Yes, thank you so much. It will be posted along with the other session soon.
Oh, can you put our contact information back up, please? And we just want to say too, like we always end our sessions just with gratitude for each and every person who came to listen today, because we realize that we say a couple of things. One is equity work, it's not easy. Like if it were easy, that means we're not doing it right. And so if we're doing it right, it's difficult. It's hard. We have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to be okay with conflict. That means not fighting, but just digging in and having hard conversations. And so again, we just have such gratitude for anybody who gets on here and stays on. Like we know we're pushing it with this information and the content. So we're just so appreciative of everybody who got on here and stayed on. So if nobody has any other questions, we are 4 minutes early.
It's been great, and it's great to see some familiar names from the Smart Start community. So it's been a pleasure.
Yes, and Arnita said the conversation is hard for both sides. It sure is. And we recognize that in the full training that we do. We talk about that quite a bit. So